Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Dennis Frize, and this afternoon I am going to give you an eyewitness account of the Battle of Falkirk by a participant, a young man from Edinburgh called James Johnson. And he joined the Prince's army at Perth, was all through the travails down to Derby and back, and in fact ended up at Culloden only 20 paces from the British muskets. But James Johnson was at this time a captain in the Prince's service. And here he tells us what happened in Stirling and Falkirk. On the 6th of January, we opened the trenches before the town of Stirling under the direction of Mr. Grant. But the mere threat of laying siege to the town induced the magistrates to repair to Bannockburn and propose a capitulation. I presume that's Bannockburn House, actually. The Prince, having granted them the conditions which they required, we took possession of Stirling the next day. The castle was not included in the surrender. To the summons of the Prince, General Blakeney answered very politely that His Royal Highness would assuredly have had a very bad opinion of him were he capable of surrendering the castle in such a cowardly manner. An army of 13,000 men, composed of the best troops of the armies of the Duke of Cumberland and Marshal Wade, entered Scotland under the command of Lieutenant General Hawley. The 1st Division, under General Huske, reached Edinburgh on 4th of January, and General Hawley himself arrived there on the 6th. The whole of General Hawley's army having assembled in Edinburgh, General Huske was detached to Linlithgow on the 13th, with the 5 old regiments of Monroe, Cholmondeley, Price, Ligonier, and Batterrow, and the remains of the 2 dragoon regiments of Hamilton and Gardner, which had escaped from the Battle of Prestonpans, and entered that small town at one end, while Lord Elcho, with our cavalry, went out at the other to fall back on Lord George Murray at Falkirk. On the 14th, the regiments of Howard, Pulteney, and Burrell marched on Borrowstone Ness, Bowness, which is halfway between Edinburgh and Stirling, and they were followed on the 15th by the regiments of Fleming and Blakeney and a battalion of the regiment of Sinclair. On the 16th, General Hawley encamped with his army and a train of 10 field pieces at Falkirk, and Lord George Murray fell back at his approach on Bannockburn, with the detachment which he had for some time the command of at Falkirk. On the evening of the 16th, the Prince gave orders for collecting together the whole army to be reviewed next morning at break of day to the east of Bannockburn. Nobody supposed there was any other object in this general review than to choose a field of battle and obtain the necessary information respecting the nature of the ground, which was the more essentially necessary as we every moment expected an attack from the English army then encamped at Falkirk. When the review was over, about 10 o'clock in the morning, he made the army face to the right to form a column and immediately moved off without any person in the army being able to penetrate his design, particularly as he did not appear at first to take the roads leading towards the English army. Our army marched across the fields and byroads to Dunnipace, leaving the highway from Stirling to Falkirk at a considerable distance on our left, and making the great circuit to conceal our movement from the enemy. Having passed through the village of Dunnipace, which is about 3.5 miles from Falkirk, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we suddenly found ourselves upon the heights near that town, in sight of the English army and within 900 yards of their camp, before General Hawley even knew of our departure from Bannockburn. Their surprise at seeing us may be easily conceived. They immediately flew to arms and with great precipitation ascended to a part of the height between us and the town of Falkirk. There was high wind, accompanied by a heavy rain, which the Highlanders, by their position, had in their back, whilst it was full in the face of the English, who were blinded by it. They were, besides, incommoded with the smoke of our discharge, and the rain, getting into their pans, rendered the half of their muskets useless. The English fruitlessly attempted to gain the advantage of the wind, but the Prince, extending to the left, took care to preserve this advantage by corresponding movements on his part. General Hawley drew up his army in order of battle in 2 lines, having 3 regiments of infantry in a hollow at the foot of the hill. His cavalry was placed before his infantry on the left wing of the first line. The English began the attack with a body of about 1,100 cavalry, who advanced very slowly against the right of our army and did not halt until they were within 20 paces of our first line to induce us to fire. The Highlanders, who had been particularly enjoined not to fire till the army was within musket length of them, discharged their muskets the moment the cavalry halted and killed about 80 men, each of them having aimed at a rider. The commander of this body of cavalry, who had advanced some paces before his men, was of that number. The cavalry, closing their ranks, which were opened by our discharge, put spurs to their horses and rushed upon the Highlanders at a hard trot, breaking their ranks, throwing down everything before them, and trampling the Highlanders under the feet of the horses. The most singular and extraordinary combat immediately followed. The Highlanders, stretching on the ground, thrust their dirks into the bellies of the horses. Some seized the riders by their clothes, dragged them down, and stabbed them with their dirks. Several again used their pistols, but few of them had sufficient space to handle their swords. MacDonald of Clanranald, chief of one of the clans of MacDonalds, assured me that whilst he was lying upon the ground under a dead horse which had fallen upon him without the power of extricating himself, he saw a dismounted horseman struggling with a Highlander. Fortunately for him, the Highlander, being the strongest, threw his antagonist, and having killed him with his dirk, and fortunately for him, the Highlander, being the strongest, and having killed him with his dirk, threw his antagonist and drew MacDonald with difficulty from under the horse. The resistance of the Highlanders was so incredibly obstinate that the English, after having been for some time engaged pell-mell with them in their ranks, were at length repulsed and forced to retire. The Highlanders did not neglect the advantage they had obtained, but pursued them keenly with their swords, running as fast as their horses, and not allowing them a moment's time to recover from their fright. Then the English cavalry, falling back on their own infantry drawn up in order of battle behind them, threw them immediately into disorder and carried the right wing of their army with them in their flight. The clan of Camerons, which was on the left of our army, having attacked at the same time the right of the English army, where there were only infantry, put it also to flight. But the Highlanders, when descending the hill in pursuit of the enemy, received on their left flank a discharge from the 3 regiments placed in the hollow at the foot of the hill, which they had not perceived till the moment they received their fire, which greatly incommoded them. Mr. John Roy Stewart, an officer in the service of France, afraid lest this might be an ambuscade laid for us by the English, called out to the Highlanders to stop their pursuit, and the cry of "Stop!" flew immediately from rank to rank and threw the whole army into disorder. However, the enemy continued their retreat, and the 3 regiments at the foot of the hill followed the rest, but with the difference that they retreated always in order, acting as a rear guard of the English army, and continued a fire of platoons on us until their entrance into the town of Falkirk. As night began to appear, the English army entered the town, and fires were immediately seen in every part of their camp, from which we all supposed they had retreated to it, and that we had not obtained a complete and substantial victory. The honour of remaining masters of the field was of little avail to us. We had no reason for believing that we had lost the battle, as the English army had retreated, but as we supposed them still in their camp, we considered it at most as undecided, and expected a renewal of combat the next morning. Fortunately, the enemy did not perceive the disorder which had crept into our army, and of which Colonel John Roy Stewart was innocent cause by his excessive precaution and foresight. The Highlanders were in complete disorder, dispersed here and there, with the different clans mingled pell-mell together, whilst the obscurity of the night added greatly to the confusion. Many of them had even retired from the field of battle, either thinking it lost or intending to seek shelter from the dreadful weather. It is often more dangerous to stop the fire and impetuosity of soldiers, of whom the best are but machines, and still more of undisciplined men who do not listen to any orders, than to let them run all risks in order to carry everything before them. I met, by accident, Colonel Brown, an Irishman, to whom I proposed that we should keep together and share the same fate. He consented, but observed at the same time that the prince having made him bearer of an order, he wished to find him with a view of communicating an answer. After having sought the prince for a long time to no purpose, and without finding anyone who could give us the least information respecting him, we fell in with his lifeguards in order of battle near a cottage on the edge of the hill, with their commander Lord Elcho, who knew as little of what had become of Charles as we did ourselves. As the night was very dark and the rain incessant, we resolved to withdraw to the mansion of Mr. Primrose of Dunnypace, about a quarter of a league from Falkirk. On our arrival at the castle, we found Lord Lewis Gordon, brother of the Duke of Gordon, Mr. Fraser, son of Lord Lovett, and 6 or 7 other chiefs of clans, but none of them knew what had become of their regiments. Other officers arrived every instant, all equally ignorant of the fate of the battle, and equally in doubt whether we had gained it or lost it. About 8 o'clock in the evening, Mr. MacDonald of Lochgarry joined us and revived our spirits by announcing for certain that we had gained a most complete victory, and that the English, instead of remaining in their camp, had fled in disorder to Edinburgh. He added, in confirmation of this news, that he had left the prince in Falkirk, in the quarters which had been occupied by General Hawley. This may give rise to the legend that actually the prince supped on General Hawley's dinner, but that's a legend. And the prince had sent him to Dunnypace for the express purpose of ordering all of us to repair to Falkirk next morning by break of day. It is impossible, without having been in our situation, to form an idea of the extreme joy which we derived from this agreeable surprise. As the enemy, in the retreat, had abandoned all their tents and baggage, their camp was soon pillaged by the Highlanders and the booty carried away, notwithstanding the obscurity of the night and the badness of the weather. The enemy lost about 600 in killed, and we took 700 prisoners. It was Lord Kilmarnock who first discovered the flight of the English. Being well acquainted with the nature of the ground, as part of his estates lay in the neighbourhood, he was sent by the prince to reconnoitre the enemy, and having approached the great road to Edinburgh beyond the town of Falkirk, passing the bypass and across fields, he saw the English army panic-struck and flying in the greatest disorder as fast as their legs could carry them. With an account of this fortunate discovery, Lord Kilmarnock immediately returned to the Prince, who still remained on the field of battle, notwithstanding the dreadful wind and rain. But he then descended from the hill about 7:30 of the clock in the evening, immediately entered the town of Falkirk, and detached as many troops as he could suddenly assemble to harass the English in their flight, who were yet a short distance from us. The enemy were unable to avail themselves of their artillery during the action, or to carry it with them in their flight, and we found next day 10 field pieces halfway up the hill, which they had not the time to draw up to the top. They lost a great many men in the hollow at the foot of the hill, where the cornfields were thickly strewed with dead bodies. In their flight, they took one prisoner in a very singular manner. Mr. MacDonald, a major of one of the MacDonald regiments, having dismounted an English officer, took possession of his horse, which was very beautiful, and immediately mounted it. When the English cavalry fled, the horse ran off with the unfortunate Mr. MacDonald, notwithstanding all his efforts to restrain him. Nor did it stop till it was at the head of the regiment, of which apparently its master was the commander. The melancholy and at the same time ludicrous figure which poor MacDonald would cut when he thus saw himself the victim of his ambition to possess a fine horse may be easily conceived. Ultimately, it cost him his life upon the scaffold. Had General Hawley possessed sufficient coolness and presence of mind when he saw our army appear upon the height to have dispassionately examined the advantages and disadvantages of attacking us immediately, and had he remained in his camp, prepared to defend himself if we attacked him, the Prince would have been dreadfully disconcerted, and I really know not what course we could have adopted. Our army could not pass the night in the open air during such a terrible tempest, and it would have been a sort of victory for General Hawley if the Prince had been obliged to return by a night march in such dreadful weather without effecting his object. But such is the nature of man, that everything unexpected and unforeseen produces an impression on the mind in proportion to its importance, or the consequences which may result of it. Hence, there are few surprises, judiciously planned and executed, which do not succeed. James Johnson went on to Culloden. He escaped. Coming south through Great Britain, he escaped to France. In France, he joined the French army and was posted where he would get his own back on the Redcoats. He was posted to Quebec, and he was made, he rose to the rank of Chevalier de Saint-Louis. I've written about him in History Scotland and in the Journal of the Jacobite Association, and he's an extremely interesting character with a life full of adventure and also a great visitor of ladies. But this, his power of description, as you see in the Battle of Falkirk, is absolutely wonderful. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.